Hi, my name's Cara, and today I'm going to talk to you about labelling mental health on social media and the importance of measurement, specifically related to the way that we create labels for supervised learning. A quick introduction to me. As I said, my name's Nina. This is a picture of me with two very sweet dogs, since I can't be standing in front of you today. I originally did a maths degree and then went on to retrain as a child protection social worker and worked with a lot of families who were experiencing poor mental health. And I became interested in the way that we can model mental health using mathematics, which has led me to where I am today, which is doing a PhD at the University of Bristol. My field of study for my PhD is largely understanding how we can predict someone's mental health and well-being through social media over time. And that is useful because it might be something we can do instead of regularly surveying people or asking them to remember how they felt a long time ago. There's a lot of ethical implications of doing that too, and so part of our work is also talking to people about how they feel about that and where the ethical boundaries of that kind of work should be. A quick disclaimer before we go on, to say that just because algorithms and machine learning are fantastic and taking over the world and all of that, it doesn't mean they're good at everything. And a key part of mental health data science is actually understanding where the skill of humans supersedes the skill of machines. We can use machines for lots of things, but we shouldn't be using them as a blunt tool for everything. And that's just something I'd like you to bear in mind as we go through. And so when we're thinking about what algorithms are good at and what humans are good at, we need to think about the machine learning workflow. Because machine learning algorithms only ever have the data that you give them to make decisions with. And it's our responsibility to create useful data sets for machines to learn from. The machine learning algorithm always wants to find patterns because that's what you've asked it to do. It always wants to take the data that you've given it and create some kind of model that will classify based on the labels that you have provided in that data. So if our labels are incorrect or not as accurate as we think they are, the machine isn't going to tell us that. And all it's going to try to do is match the labels to the patterns that it can see in the data. And what that might mean is it's creating spurious correlations or spurious associations between certain patterns and certain labels that, it can't tell us that that's not what depression looks like. That's for us to decide. We were interested in how other people have done this so far. So we have done a scoping review of across 4 databases and screened about 1,500 papers, eventually coming down to 66 papers, where we looked at how people have predicted mental health on Twitter. And we were particularly interested in the datasets that they used, the features they made from those datasets, how they defined mental health, the algorithms they'd used, and their results. But in particular, and what I'll talk about today, is the ways that they defined mental health in those datasets. And so, looking at all of those papers, we had a look at which type of mental health each of them said they were trying to predict. And this is a graph of all the different types of mental health that were covered and which papers were trying to predict which. So some of them are connected to more than one because they approached it as a multicast problem, but most of them are just connected to one mental health mode. And you can see that the most popular out of those are depression and suicidality. It's all very well though saying that you're predicting depression. What we were really interested in is what does that mean in the context of social media data? And how do you decide that it's depression that you're actually predicting? And so this is what we found. Out of 66 studies, there were 55 unique datasets that we assessed. 9 of those had ground truth available to them. And when I say ground truth, I mean that they were able to contact participants outside of their social media online presence and ask them to complete a mental health questionnaire, or they already knew that they had mental ill health from an offline situation. Of the other 39 that we were able to assess, some of those used self-disclosures of mental health, which would be something like sharing "I have depression" online, and some of them used keywords or combinations of keywords. Then within that, there were annotations that were made of those datasets. Some didn't annotate, some just took the keywords or the presence of self-disclosure as a label itself, but in quite a few of the cases there was an extra level where somebody went through the data and individually classified each person as truly being depressed or not, or whatever other mental illness they were exploring. In some cases, the person doing that was a person with clinical expertise in mental health, but in quite a few cases, it tended to be the person who was doing the machine learning themselves, and that usually meant they were a data scientist. So whilst they may have lived experience of mental health, they weren't necessarily clinically trained. And so these are some of the examples of the search terms that were being used. I have depression, I have anxiety, or hashtag depression and hashtag mental health. And then some other ones which are medication names. There's a few different things we could say here, but I think the main concern that we have about using these search terms to create data sets of people with mental health is that all that we're finding is the people who are talking about their mental health. This is potentially missing a huge number of people who don't talk about their mental illness online. It means that we're assuming that those people who have genuine mental illnesses are going to be writing about them online. And then it also means we're assuming that the people who are writing about their mental illnesses online have genuine mental illnesses. We can't verify either of those claims because we don't have the ground truth data available to us to do so. So why is that a problem? Let's assume that this is a population of people who we're studying. The people in blue are people who have depression and who talk about it online. The people in purple are people who have depression and don't talk about it online. So when we're searching for people with depression online, we're searching for cases rather than controls. And you might not be familiar with that terminology. Cases would be people who have the characteristic that you're interested in this case, a mental health illness. And controls are people who don't have that characteristic. So in here, the people in black are the people who are our controls. So say our search terms that we were just talking about, our keywords and self-disclosures, pick up this group of people here, so 3 blues and a black person. So the 3 blues are correct, they're the people that we wanted and we expected to pick up. The black person maybe has been picked up spuriously because they used some of those keywords even though they don't have a in-life diagnosis of depression. We haven't picked up any of our purple people because they don't use any of those keywords online, so they are essentially invisible to us in our search terms. So now that we have our cases, we also need some controls, and in most of these studies people also use Twitter and the Twitter API to search for control cases, and they assumed controls were all those people who didn't use those search terms online. So if we take a sample of this group, 2 purple people have ended up in that group because, as far as we know, they don't have any mental illness. So this is an example of where things might get a bit tricky, because if we assume that 1 in 4 people has some kind of mental health difficulty, then we are almost always going to pick up people with a mental illness in our control group because we can't verify whether or not they do have a mental illness. So here's another example. Let's say we have 3 people. 1 of them has never self-disclosed on social media and rarely posts about their feelings, they keep it to work stuff. 1 speaks openly about their mental health diagnosis on Twitter, but not necessarily their feelings. And 1 person talks about their feelings quite a lot on Twitter, but has never actively stated their diagnosis. So in this example, let's say that we have our short list of potential users and someone is going through and further annotating them to decide if they're indicative of depression. And in this case it's a computer science researcher, so not someone with mental health expertise, and they're deciding whether a tweet looks risky. So our first 2 people, they don't decide they do, but the last person who talks about their feelings quite openly is classified as positive. Or this data-driven approach, which is that someone has used the string depress, which might be depression, depressing, in a tweet more than 5 times in 2 weeks. And actually none of our people meet that criteria, so none of them are included in that dataset. So those are just some examples of the ways in which the way we classify and define mental illness and the way we annotate it can have a huge impact on the data that we're actually picking up. we don't actually know how many of each of these types of people there are on the internet because we don't have access to that ground truth data. It's very, very difficult to say how accurate we're being. Not only do we not know how many of each of those people exist online, but we also know that when we're relying on keywords to pull in our data sets, we're restricting ourselves to certain geographical and cultural understandings of language. And what I mean by that is, if you're based in the US, you might use the word Prozac as a depression medication, and that might be one of your keywords. Prozac is probably less likely to pull up people with depression in the UK because it's not a word we use as often to talk about our depression medication. And it's not a case that we don't use it at all, it's just the frequency with which that's going to be a useful keyword changes from country to country. And that's just to English-speaking countries, let alone how that applies to other countries within Europe or even more broadly than that across the world. So another thing we really need to consider when we're talking about language and how we use it to create datasets like this is how culturally specific it's making us. So to conclude, what are we actually predicting when we use these types of data to create models to predict mental health on Twitter or Facebook or any social media? Maybe what we're actually predicting is people who disclose their mental health status on Twitter, because that's the data that we have collected and found. Or we're predicting people who use keywords for antidepressants. We might be predicting people who appear to be unstable on social media. And unstable, that means whatever you want it to mean for whoever is annotating the data. Or maybe we're just predicting people who tweet about depression. In all of these cases, we can't be certain that what we're predicting is people who have depression in the offline world, because we don't have the information to know that that's what we're doing, unless we have the opportunity to assess them and assess the mental health in the offline world before we collect their online data. And that connection between the offline and online assessments is really, really important for high quality data sets. At the end of the day, the machine learning models will find patterns in whatever you give it. And if you're using the data that you have labelled to both train and evaluate your model, then it's very likely that your model will appear to be successful. What I hope we can take away from this thought about how we label mental health is that even though we can decide on many different ways to conceptualise and label mental health, like binary versus continuous or network versus discrete characteristics, knowing that what we've labelled the data as is what it actually is probably the most basic and important part of the entire workflow. And without having done that, and without being able to do that, there is absolutely no guarantee that we're producing algorithms that can actually do what they say on the tin. And as a researcher, being really transparent about how you label your dataset and how you've defined those mental illnesses is also incredibly important when we're thinking about publishing our work and the accountability in terms of the implications of the kinds of algorithms we're making. If you want to get in touch with me at all, then that's my email address and my Twitter account. And thanks to my supervisors and the other people on my team for all their work on this as well.